All right, this is immigration attorney Paris Malakouti. Today's August 21st, 2025, and this is our 28th mobility space. Today we're talking about birth tourism, the concept, strategies, tactics, considerations, possible drawbacks. And as a reminder, this space is part of our series of 50 spaces on the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, sovereignty, and of course, passports. So today we want to talk about birth tourism, right? And the general idea, I think, for birth tourism is basically going to another country with the express purpose of giving birth there so that the child can attain the citizenship of that country, right? I think birth tourism generally works best when the parents come from strong jus sanguinis citizenship countries. So from countries that have robust regimes for transmitting citizenship by blood. And that then, of course, allows, in theory at least, for the parents to give birth to the child in another country, a third country, or a second country if the two parents are from the same country, and of course allow the child to attain the citizenship of the country that they were born in, okay, by jus soli, right of dirt, right of land, and then, of course, the citizenship or citizenships of the parents by blood, jus sanguinis. Of course, as with all strategies, all mobility strategies, the devil is in the details, and there's different considerations, of course, that make the strategy more or less plausible for different people. So, just a couple considerations that come to my mind. One is that oftentimes, in order to execute such a strategy, people have to give birth away from their family, right? And typically, giving birth is, a big event in the parent's life, especially in the mother. And oftentimes, the mothers want to be close to family, close to their own mother, sisters, father, to have support, both emotional support and then obviously to help out when possible. It's not impossible, of course, to give birth close to your family, even if you're doing birth tourism. But of course, if your parents are from one country and then you're giving birth in a different country, the likelihood of the chances of that, parents and close family member that can help being close, obviously could be less. The other one is possible pre-existing health conditions that could lead to a delicate pregnancy, especially if you're from a rich country and if you're trying to do birth tourism in a country that doesn't have medical facilities that are as good. Then obviously that could be a concern. It also could be a concern if you're trying to give birth in a country that has a language that you don't know or you don't know as well, right? Obviously, parents and mothers feel more comfortable communicating with doctors and medical professionals in a language that they feel, comfortable and highly fluent in order to be able to understand risks and obviously be able to explain their own priorities and considerations to medical staff. A third consideration, I would say, is if you're relying on a jus sanguinis citizenship to be able to transmit the parents' citizenship, that citizenship, right? So, as an example, if you are giving birth in, let's say you're an American, of course. So, a lot of our listeners are Americans. So, if you're an American, American parents doing birth tourism, giving birth to a child in another country, let's call it Argentina, for example, and you want the child, let's say, to have U.S. citizenship, and you're relying on a citizenship by descent, American citizenship by descent, for that citizenship to pass on to the child. Well, there's actually gradations in the robustness of different methods of transmission of U.S. citizenship, and it's the same in most countries. Citizenship by through a parent, through an American parent. So citizenship of a child born outside the United States through an American parent is not a constitutional benefit. It's not a constitutional citizenship. It's by statute. And so what that means is that Congress can and does change the conditions for transmission of American citizenship to a child that's born outside the United States. Whereas a child born in the United States, especially born to a U.S. citizen or to a legal permanent resident, has a stronger right of transmission of citizenship. It's constitutional. So the bottom line is, if you're relying on jus sanguinis citizenship for the child to be able to get the parents' citizenship, well, like I said, that might not be as robust of a transmission, if the child is born outside the United States. So that's just something to consider. Other considerations, of course, some countries have limits on jus sanguinis, citizenship by descent, right? So, United Kingdom, Mexico are countries that have a one generational limit. So, a child born to a Mexican citizen that was born in Mexico. So, if the parent was born in Mexico, that child typically attains, for example, Mexican citizenship. But that child's child, if born outside of Mexico, might not attain citizenship, so, Mexican citizenship by birth. So the upshot is, if it's important for a family to maintain and continue passing jus sanguinis citizenship through the generations, if that citizenship is in a country that has a limit on the number of generations that can be born outside of the country and still transmit citizenship, well, that might cut against wanting to go abroad to basically engage in birth tourism, right? So these are some considerations. There's also obviously some other practical considerations. If the child's born abroad, and if you went to that country just for the express purpose of giving birth for the child to get citizenship, well, you might obviously want to travel back to your home country ASAP. And obviously, to do that, you typically need to get travel documents, possibly travel documents of both countries. So possibly a passport from both countries that your child is a citizen of. That obviously has some time vulnerability there, especially if there's a backlog, or if there's a difficulty getting those travel documents. Then, as a practical matter, the child could end up spending more time in that country that they were born in than you intended. So these are some considerations. Now, what are the reasons that you might want to, or a person might want to engage in birth tourism? So the first one is, I think, the most obvious, which is just to be able to attain the regular benefits of getting another citizenship. So immediate highest right of entry and residence in another country, the second country, typically another passport or travel document issued by that country, typically another set of visa-free access that citizens of that second country get. Right, these are all typical benefits that people get from having dual citizenship or multiple citizenship tourism. But there's also other types of benefits as well, right? United States, of course, has citizenship-based taxation, and there's an exit tax for certain covered expatriates that renounce U.S. citizenship. And what do you know? There's an exemption that a lot of people talk about. There's a dual citizenship exemption in the U.S. tax code from the exit tax, right? So those people who are American dual citizens from birth, so it can't be a dual citizen who attained one of the citizenships through naturalization. They have to have been born a dual citizen, and if they fulfill other criteria, period of residence, they can qualify for an exit tax exemption. So that might be a long-term planning consideration for some people who are considering engaging in birth tourism. So anyway, that's kind of the intro. I'd like to open up with a general question, which is, what do people think? And maybe I'll make this a targeted question. Maybe I'll start with David. We got David here. We got Jay. We got Hal. We got Chris. We got Drew in LA. Let me kick off a general question to David here. David, what do you think are some main considerations in deciding whether to attempt or consider birth tourism?
Switching to speaker mode, and I didn't hear the question.
Oh, no problem, David. General question for you, and other people can chime in on this as well. What do you think are the main considerations for a person, a couple to consider when thinking about whether they want to attempt birth tourism?
Off the top of my head, I would imagine it would be for greater access to other countries for their children, perhaps even for the parents themselves. Whether it be naturalization or the ability to obtain some kind of lawful residency status. I think those are the typical benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as inconvenience goes, when it comes to giving birth in a foreign country, especially if it's a country that the parents haven't spent significant time in, I tend to think it kind of takes kind of an adventurous type of couple, especially the mother, right? The person who's going to be going through the actual act of giving birth. I tend to think that it takes a little bit of adventure, right? Because obviously when you're going through something like childbirth, people want to have as many, as few variables as possible, I think, generally. So for accepting situations where people are desperate to get out of a really bad situation, a really bad home country situation. I tend to think it takes a certain profile, right? I think couples who are dealing with high risk pregnancies, or a lot of fear surrounding the pregnancy, would probably are generally probably less willing to try to engage in birth tourism. What do you think, David?
Yes, I completely agree with that. Um, yeah, it's actually something that my wife and I were considering doing with our last pregnancy. But I think in the end we kind of reconsidered because we realized that our children would likely be dual citizens from birth already, regardless of where we gave birth. So we opted not to. But
Nice.
for people who have a compelling reason to do it, I think it could make a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Jay, we got Jay here. Jay, if you can speak, general question for you, same question. What do you think are if you had to rank order the most important considerations, generally speaking, what do you think they are for people deciding whether to try a birth tourism?
I would say the general considerations would be first, what are you getting out of this? And this could be for you or for your child. There must be some kind of reason to pack up and go to a country that, in many cases, is across the world, or even just another country in general to give birth. Um, and then second, of course, is the feasibility of it, because if these folks are people with normal jobs, normal incomes, then that's going to be a little bit harder to pull off than for somebody who has a lot of money and time and energy to spend on this. And then, of course, another consideration would be what is your what are your original nationalities, and what does the new country sort of add to that? For example, I've heard a lot about Russian women going to give birth in places like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and one of the big things that was going on recently were a lot of Russian women going to Argentina to give birth, and then immediately naturalizing in Argentina, and then pretty much subsequently leaving Argentina and going back to Russia. Um, and the objective of that seemed to have been to get access to the Schengen area and get access to the wider world through a country that is quite neutral, not heavily sanctioned, that they can use to get some of these springboard benefits of that citizenship.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to your very precise example. Actually, I recently had a client, a couple, Russian woman, and she went to Argentina and gave birth in Argentina, and they were my clients, and it was for the express purpose of basically, well, it was multi-pronged, but one of the purposes was to obtain citizenship, Argentine citizenship for the child. The other one was basically, to allow this lady who was against the Russian war effort in Ukraine to basically allow her to have a safe place that she could be resident and not feel uncomfortable, to say the least, if not unsafe, being in Russia as kind of somebody who's against the Russian war. So yeah, that's an absolutely important consideration. I would add a few others, not considerations, but I think just kind of profiles that more fit, right? It's harder to do this type of thing if you don't have, if you're not a remote worker, right? If you have a job that requires you to show up in person, right? That's going to be a lot more difficult, right? Because even on a tight timeline, right, you're still going to be spending significant time in the other country. Even if you just try to get in there, as late as possible in the pregnancy and then leave as soon as possible after the child is born, I think realistically, most people are looking at least 3, 4 weeks of staying in that other country, and that's a best case scenario. Obviously, because of potential complications that can arise, people need to have more of a runway of time to be able to spend in that second country, the country that they're trying to obtain citizenship in. The other thing is we see a division in the hemispheres, right? Citizenship based on birth on the land, so jus soli is a lot more prevalent, almost entirely prevalent only in the Western Hemisphere. So North America, Central America, South America. This type of birthright citizenship is much less common in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, right? So as far as profiles are concerned, I mean, obviously people from outside of the Western Hemisphere coming into the Western Hemisphere, right, might be a profile, and then obviously intra-Western Hemisphere. So uh, people from all over the world coming to the United States, and then of course Americans, going to Central America or South America for birth tourism. But you're not really gonna get that far going to France as a tourist, or Middle Eastern country trying to give birth there and get automatic citizenship. You might get a preferred path to residency based off of the child's birth in the country, but generally for straightaway citizenship, it's almost entirely a Western Hemisphere phenomenon. Um, let's talk countries. Countries. What do we think are the most attractive countries? I think most people, if not at least a plurality of people on this call are Americans, right? So probably most people on this call are not thinking about traveling to the United States for birthright tourism. There could be some that are thinking about it, but what are countries that people on this call find generally attractive or think are good destinations for birthright tourism? We obviously heard about Argentina. That seems to be a popular one. What do you think, Jay? What have you thought about? What have you heard about as far as attractive destinations for in the Western Hemisphere for birthright tourism besides Argentina?
So I've heard of a lot of places, but of course Argentina is a big one. I've actually been to a lot of these places that people are talking about for this, and I personally I was really impressed by Chile. I've heard good things with Uruguay, and of course I've been to Argentina. Argentina is a great country. And then Brazil, of course, I spent a lot of time in, and I'm not sure I would recommend it at this moment, but it's another country that pops up a lot in these discussions. Others would be, I guess, that I haven't been to: Costa Rica, Barbados, and Mexico. And those seem to be the countries that have been most talked about. Although I personally, if I were picking a country, maybe for a client or personally, I would probably go for Chile, Uruguay, or Argentina. And Chile is a little bit trickier to do. There are some processes that need to be followed in that country, but there's also a little bit of legislative change in Argentina regarding how much time you have to spend in the country to become a naturalized citizen. So if somebody wants to do that immediately and then go back home, well, then that could pose an issue. But I think Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay are probably the best options for that in my view.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about some of those countries that you mentioned as well, Chile, Uruguay. What if you're a U.S. citizen and you're thinking long term? You want to give your child the ability to renounce U.S. citizenship in the future if they want to, the option to. They're not saying that they have to, but to still have maximum access to the United States as much as possible as a non-U.S. citizen. Um, what do you think about trying to execute a birthright tourism strategy to other members of NAFTA, so Mexico, Canada, to be able to give preferred access to the U.S. to your child in case? So first of all, dual citizenship from birth, right? So IRC 877A, dual citizenship exemption if they choose to renounce citizenship, and then their alternate citizenship being another one of the countries that borders the United States, Mexico or Canada. Mexicans, of course, need a visa to be able to enter the United States. Canadians do not need a visa, but both have access to TN visas, right? What do you think about that as a strategy, Jay?
I think if somebody is really concerned about having access to the U.S., that could be a good strategy. Chile as well has a lot of. They have the H-1B1 visa, and they have visa-free access to the U.S. as well, so that could be a consideration. But all in all, if somebody who's not a U.S. citizen is concerned about access to the U.S., then probably the U.S. would be the place to do it. But if someone is a U.S. citizen, then the concern might be better placed on continuing to be a U.S. citizen in the future, and potentially trying to maintain that other citizenship that they choose via birth tourism. But I'm not necessarily somebody who thinks that it makes a whole lot of sense to link those two. But that could be wrong, I guess.
No,
I just wouldn't think of it that way.
No, we're just having a conversation. We're soliciting opinions and having discussion. Just a general comment. I've had people come and have consultations with me and talk about mobility plans and mention the possibility of birth tourism as part of it. In practice, and again, I'm just one lawyer, so I don't know if this has been other people's experience or not. But in practice, I find that the number of people who execute a plan is way smaller than the number of people who are kind of excited about the idea of executing the plan. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think it comes down to kind of just people really coming to terms when they get pregnant with the unfamiliarity and the discomfort of giving birth in a foreign country. I think once that actually becomes real, the attractiveness of the plan goes down. But as a result, in the category of people, let's call it, to be frank, non-desperate people who are just kind of long-term planning, wanting, to get citizenship, second, third, fourth citizenship for their children. I tend to find, the people who are actually willing to execute on the plan is really a fraction of those who are interested in it and talk about it. That's been my experience. I do know some people who have done birth tourism. Obviously, I consume some of the same content online that a lot of people here do. People, stories that go viral. There was a woman who went viral, I think, a year or two ago. Young woman gave birth in Costa Rica, and she made a kind of a viral TikTok about her experience doing it. Mainstream media picked it up, wrote a bunch of articles on it, and some people were jazzed up about it, excited about the possibility. Mainstream media in Costa Rica also picked it up, and then there was actually like a little mini backlash, about it. So I saw that. I don't know if anybody else on this call saw that as well, but I don't know. It just seems to me that it seems to me to be an idea, a tactic. I know it can be done in practice. I've seen it be done in practice, but I think it's a lot less attractive when it comes time to executing than people think it is. What do you think, David, about that? You were just open a moment ago about having considered it with you and your wife. Were you turned off? If you don't, you feel comfortable answering this, understand. If not, totally understand. Were you turned off in practice once you actually were faced with the idea of the unfamiliarity in doing it?
A little bit, but we were actually considering doing it in Mexico. One of the main reasons that we decided not to do it is just that we realized that because I have a Mexican ancestor, I actually qualify for Mexican nationality by birth, and so do all of our children. And so that's actually due to a fairly recent change in the Mexican Constitution in 2021. They redefined the meaning of Mexican nationality by birth, so that it extends not only to those people who are born inside of the Mexican territory, but also to anyone who was born to a Mexican national as a parent. And that it used to extend before the redefinition in 2021 only to the first generation that was born outside of Mexico. But after the constitutional change, the redefinition, it extends indefinitely ad infinitum throughout all generations. And so it's a strictly a jus sanguinis thing at this point. And so we realized, it's not necessary to have our baby in Mexico because our baby will be born a Mexican. So for that reason, we decided to have our baby inside the United States, where we were more comfortable.
Yeah, wonderful. Fairly recent change, right? 4 years ago. So I'll check this, but I believe that's only moving forward, right? I don't think that applies post hoc, but I'm gonna look into that actually, and I'll basically I'll mention that just in case anybody has any curiosity on that point. Okay, cool. Yeah. So in your case, you basically realize you're gonna get the benefit anyway without having to go through the hassle of giving birth there. That makes sense. We got Hal here. Welcome, Hal. Any thoughts you have, or do you wanna give what you think are kind of the main considerations for people considering this?
Not really. Just a very interesting topic. I came in to listen, and I think for Americans, it makes more sense to give birth in Canada rather than any Latin American country. But that's my thought. So.
Got it. And is that because Canadians don't require a visa to visit the United States? They have 6 months stay. They're part of the NAFTA treaty. Is that why?
Yeah, that's why. But also, your kids will be able to study in Canada far cheaper than in America. I mean, in college degrees and stuff will be cheaper.
Yeah, that's certainly a consideration. Universities are ridiculously expensive in the United States now. I mean, it's not even, so much of university education in the United States now is about just the flash and the pizzazz of going to these universities. Huge stadiums, huge campuses, programs. Most of the rest of the world doesn't treat university education like this. The focus is on basically the learning, right? So, just a little anecdote from my background. I went to University of Miami for law school. That's where I got my degree. But I did a semester of law school at the University of Versailles in Saint-Quentin. As I've stated before, I mentioned before on I think a podcast. At the time that I was an exchange student in Versailles, that was 2011. My semesterly tuition was 18,000 at the University of Miami, and it was 200 euros at the University of Versailles. Right, so a tiny fraction. Now, what's the difference? Well, University of Miami has a huge, beautiful campus. I mean, it looks like out of a postcard. It looks like like a resort almost. University of Versailles, Saint-Quentin, so the law school, which is in Saint-Quentin, not actually in Versailles. It's just a collection of drab buildings, right? Which is not nice, not expensive, not state of the art, right? Just focusing on the learning, right? So, Hal brings up a great point, right? If you're thinking about secondary education for future generations, having reduced tuition access could be a serious consideration. For birthright tourism, not so much for Europe, unfortunately, because most European countries don't have jus solis. They don't have a law whereby if you give birth, if undocumented parents or tourist, parents that are just tourists give birth there, the kid automatically gets citizenship. They don't. But Canada does, right? And Canada's has cheaper higher education. So yeah, I think that's certainly a consideration that would be on some people's minds. All right. So let's see here. Americans. Okay, so Hal thinks if you're American, makes sense if you're thinking about birth tourism, to target Canada first. Jay, not necessarily so much. Quick question for you, David. If you had not found out that your children were already entitled to Mexican citizenship, do you think you would have executed the birth tourism plan in Mexico?
I think we were probably 50-50 on that. I mean, I mean, there's some personal details I could get into offline, but in general,
need to.
I think what we found out, what we discovered is that giving birth in Mexico would very likely entail a C-section, because that's extraordinarily popular in Mexico. That's not what we were aiming for, and so we were kind of on the fence about going there, but it was probably a 50-50 decision.
That's a great point. And I didn't even think about that. Differing medical protocols and standards in different countries. And you went right to the heart of one of the most important ones, right? In some countries, C-sections, it's like, oh, any little tiny, anything less than a perfect profile, C-section. In some other countries, C-section is considered more serious, and they're not as quick to jump to the C-section. So that's a great point, right? Different, obviously when you give birth in a different country, you kind of have to plug into the environment, medical protocol environment, let's call it, in that country. And obviously that's going to differ from country to country. So there's another important consideration. How about language? I mean, is that an easily surmountable obstacle? Oh, just make sure you get a translator, make sure you splurge on translators. Or is there something to be said for the mother and the father being able to communicate directly with medical staff at a high level without any medium in between? What do you think about the language barrier? Is that a tier one consideration, or is that less than tier one? What do you think, Jay?
I think the language aspect is really important, because both during the birth itself, but also if we're looking at things like prenatal care and being able to just go around and do things in that society, and recovery and all of that, being able to at least have some kind of rudimentary understanding of the common language in that country is probably very important to be able to do. From what I've seen online, and I don't actually know anybody who's done this, but from what I've seen online, it seems to be that the folks who are most serious about actually going and doing birth tourism are people who plan to at least create some ties to that particular country, or need that residency, or want that citizenship to get out of some difficult situation in a different country, like your Russian client. So language is probably a big part of both the process of birth, and then also what utility you or your child could get out of it later. Because if let's say somebody goes and gives birth in Uruguay and doesn't speak a lick of Spanish, and then goes back to, say, New York or Moscow or somewhere, and then they don't speak any Spanish, and their child doesn't speak any Spanish, so how much utility is access to Uruguay and the surrounding area really going to give that person? That's an open question.
Yeah, I tend to think that the language barrier, if one is going to exist, is an important consideration. I would put it tier one, just because I see how often things get lost in translation. And even when people are speaking, when you're talking about complicated things like childbirth, even when you're speaking the same language, two native speakers, things still get confused and mixed up, right? So I tend to think that that's a tier one consideration, especially if the mother is older, right? So if it's quote unquote a geriatric pregnancy, or one in which any type of issue or potential issue is anticipated, right? The younger the mother is, the healthier the mother is, the less complex the birth. I tend to think that, people can be a little bit more daring, with giving birth in a country where usually they don't know the language at all. I guess that's really daring. Or even if they know the language, but just don't know it, that well. So maybe let's call it like rudimentary proficiency, right? So So obviously the importance of that consideration, at least in my opinion, depends on the profile, right, of the couple and potential complications for the baby. Now, here's another consideration, right? Could doing birth tourism jeopardize a person's, the parent's ability to visit or access that country in the future, right? And the answer is yeah, it can in some instances, right? United States is an example. So it's not illegal, okay, or per se a violation to give birth in the United States as a tourist, so on a B2 tourist visa or an ESTA. However, it's not. It is a violation. It could be considered a violation of the terms of your visa to obtain a visa and come to the United States as a tourist for the express purpose of giving birth, right? So, and it's if you're 5 months pregnant, right, and you get a B2 tourist visa and you come in and you stay all the way through pregnancy and you give birth, right, and then you leave the United States and then you're applying for a tourist visa in the future, that timeline, a CBP officer, or actually in this case it would be an adjudicator, a consular adjudicator, they could look at that timeline and combine with other factors and other facts, infer that the person had the intent of coming to the United States for the purpose of giving birth when they applied for the visa. And so if they had that intent, at the time that they applied for the visa, and if they executed on the plan, then that would be a violation of the terms of the visa, right? So that could possibly jeopardize the person's access, to the United States in the future. Just colloquially, I haven't heard of that consideration being as much of an issue in Latin American countries, so in Central and South American countries. I suspect that if the popularity of birth tourism really picks up in serious numbers going forward, that could potentially be, end up being an issue. But so far, I see that as kind of being more of an issue for people who are planning to use the United States as a destination for birth tourism, as opposed to other countries. What about fairness? I mean, is this fair? Does anybody have any thoughts on whether this could be, is this abusing a country's, laws and society to try to come to that country, with the express purpose of giving birth there? Does anybody think there's an ethical objection to this? Let me ask Hal first, and then I'll go to Jay. Hal, is there anything unethical you think about doing this?
Yeah, probably, but it more depends on the family and character of the people and the culture and the upbringing. If people are trying to establish a new family, then they're probably looking for better access to education and a job market. So they're looking for social mobility, and they're not looking for welfare or other ways to get from the government some the benefit. Is that they will be future taxpayers and future net positive citizens. In that regard, yeah, I think it's positive, but it all depends on the family and their intentions.
Okay, Jay, what do you think?
I would think it's probably fine in terms of ethics, as long as the country hasn't really expressly taken steps that's signal that maybe they don't want this. Like the U.S. to some extent has cracked down on this in their visa issuances. At least that's what I've been told. And so in the U.S., the government has said, well, put into practice that maybe they don't really want people to come in specifically for that purpose. So if somebody is going to do that in the U.S., the country doesn't really want that, then maybe that might be a little bit unethical. But I think that in countries that haven't commented or even really put that into consideration, if they don't really care, then I don't think it's a good reason to judge by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know.
Go ahead, Jay.
I don't know what you think, Parviz, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think it's unethical. If somebody's following the law, if the law says that you attain citizenship of a country by being born there, in the absence of some sort of countervailing consideration in the law. So it's kind of like what you said. Unless it's specified in the law that you can't come with the express purpose of, for example, we give citizenship to those who are born here, but we don't want birth tourism. In the absence of something like that, no, I don't think there's any problem with it. I don't think it's unethical at all. People act in their own best self-interest. People should be expected to act and plan according to the laws of countries in a way that's going to benefit them. That's normal. That's acceptable. I don't find that unethical in any way, shape, or form. I don't think there's any type of masochistic duty to not accrue as many benefits as you can for you and your children under the law. So no, I don't have any ethical objection to it. What about you, David? Do you think, let's just play devil's advocate. What's the best argument for an ethical objection to this practice? And I know I just said that I don't find it unethical, but let's play devil's advocate. What do you think it is, David?
Well, if we consider that citizenship is both a collection of rights and responsibilities, but a person or a family is trying to obtain the benefits of citizenship while avoiding the responsibilities of it, I think that's where you could go astray ethically, potentially, even though it may be in the letter of the law that this birth tourism is a way of obtaining the citizenship itself. So I don't know if you go into it with the intention of actually being a citizen and living as a citizen of that country where you're doing the birth tourism, then I think there's no ethical objection at all.
Okay, there you go. We have a rough consensus in the group. Nobody thinks it's unethical. Surprise, surprise, generally speaking. Okay, cool. We haven't spoken much about drawbacks, right? Obviously, one consideration, just a general default consideration for obtaining any citizenship of a country is this group of red flags of second citizenship, right? So what I classify them as being is extraterritorially imposed obligations or drawbacks of a citizenship. The short list, there's a long list, but the short list tends to be, and we've spoken about this before, 1, citizenship-based taxation, 2, mandatory military service obligation, 3, a prohibition on relinquishment of the citizenship, and then 4, citizenship or citizens being widely subject to international sanctions, right? So this is the bundle of kind of what I tend to believe and find is the 4 most common and impactful red flags of second citizenship. This should be a consideration, irrespective of this context of birth tourism. Like I said, in considering any second citizenship, this should be a consideration, right? It also, kind of to the point. I think it was David's point right now. If you consider that getting a citizenship is not just all peaches and cream, it's not just all benefits, but they have obligations that come with them, right? That kind of dissipates, right, some of the ethical obligation or the ethical objection that some people might have, right? If you actually consider that, hey, if you get the citizenship, you're not just getting benefits, you're subjecting yourself to the laws of this country, even extraterritorially, right? So yeah, I do tend to think of citizenship as a ledger sheet with a credits and debits, a pros and cons, right? And if you consider citizenship that way, I don't think there's anything unethical. I think there's a practical consideration for people, to think about whether they want to give their child a citizenship in a country that they think is headed the wrong way, especially vis-a-vis extraterritorially imposed obligations. Yeah, no ethical consideration, no ethical objection, like I said, from my standpoint. As far as red flags of second citizenship, what are we concerned about in common, or let's say popularly discussed birth tourism countries, right? United States, of course, has citizenship-based taxation. We haven't had. You have to register for not the selective service. Yeah, excuse me. What is it? It's selective service. Excuse me. You have to register for selective service, but we haven't had a draft in the United States since 1971, right? Argentina has a constitutionally mentioned restriction on renunciation of citizenship. Argentina has, one of these potentially has one of these red flags of second citizenship. What do we think about other countries, and whether they might have a red flag that makes it unattractive to even consider them for birth tourism? Is there any? Let me start off with this question to David. USA, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Panama, Uruguay, Brazil, Costa Rica. Any of these countries that, from what you know, you would take off the list for consideration? You'd never consider for birth tourism?
Off the top of my head, I don't think I could take any off the list. I don't know enough about them.
Okay, fair answer. We appreciate the candor. How about you, Jay? Any of these that you would take off the list?
Okay, I would take Panama off the list, and that's not because of anything specific about their citizenship, but because I personally went there and I didn't like it.
Okay. Yeah, and look, you know what? I'm glad you brought that up, because attachment to a country, that's a factor. How much you like the country, right? It's not just all about, cold calculation of benefits and drawbacks, right? I do think that it's a legitimate consideration for a person to say, hey, I like this country, I like the culture, I like the association. Subjective factors. Okay, can I see myself being a Panama guy, or no, I'm not a Panama guy? I think that's a legitimate consideration, even if you have a hard time objectively quantifying the quality of the country, that makes it unattractive to you. So yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's a legitimate consideration. There are certain countries, I try not to mention them publicly in podcasts and stuff, but there's some certain countries I just don't like. They just rub me the wrong way. The cultures are just not, they're not my jam, as they say. What about you, Hal? Any of these countries, are there any countries that you would not consider for birth tourism, or you think people should give a second look at before they do it, because of a red flag of second citizenship, because of a potentially present or future extraterritorially imposed obligation on citizens of the country?
Yeah, I think if you're not American, you probably should not try to give birth in America because of citizenship-based taxation. And second is try to find a place where not only your child will get the citizenship, but also siblings for the child and maybe parents as well. So those countries more prioritize, in my opinion. And if you're American and you don't want to go outside to give a birth, you may try Puerto Rico, and that birth certificate will help you to get in even one more passport, Spanish citizenship in 2 years if they reside there. So try to look at the countries where one of their with the passport would springboard to another citizenship, so it gives one more option, like a Spanish passport, Portuguese passport, or even if you're born in one of the Latin American countries, some of their legislations state that If you're coming from another Hispanic Latin American country, you have fast track. Instead of 4 years, you get 1 year of naturalization period. So look out for those things too. I think that using one passport to springboard to another and having this matryoshka type of Russian doll type of thinking about what one passport can give to get another one and so on.
Yeah, great point about springboarding from one citizenship or using one citizenship as a springboard to another, right? So Ibero-American countries, right? So oftentimes, to your point, not oftentimes, many countries allow a reduced path to their naturalization, reduced path of residency if the person is a citizenship, a natural citizen of another Ibero-American country. That's a great point, and one that we didn't really think about, right? So Spain, right, which is an EU citizenship, Spanish citizenship is people who are citizens, natural citizens of most Latin American countries and also the Philippines have a reduced residency path to Spanish naturalization eligibility. So only 2 years as opposed to 10 or whatever else it might be. So yeah, that's absolutely a great point. And then Hal brought up the nested dolls. You said matrushka, something like that. We call them nested dolls, right? You open one doll and there's a doll in the other. And yeah, I think that's a great analogy, right? One thing about the United States, I'll push back. I'll play devil's advocate, right? Hal said, and I think a lot of people kind of in our space say, oh, I would want to avoid giving birth in the United States or giving the child, U.S. citizenship, presumably because of the obligations that we spoke about. But I think it really depends on what socioeconomic level you're coming from, right? If you're desperate, if you're from a poor country, and many immigrants in the United States come from poor countries, right? If you live paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, right? The opportunities, the economic opportunities that the United States gives, the job market, okay, super high paying job market, can outweigh what the obligations might be, okay, vis-a-vis citizenship-based taxation, as well as just reporting obligations, right? Like FATCA, FBAR, these types of things. So I think it really depends. The attractiveness of the United States for birthright citizenship entirely depends on where you're coming from. What's your status? Do you come from some money? Are you coming from another country that has, a strong citizenship, or are you coming from a poor place, right? There's a hierarchy of considerations, right? If you're dirt poor, then the prospect of being subject to citizenship-based taxation in the future, if you live abroad, if you live outside the United States, is just not that important of a consideration. But if you're in a better situation, then that is a more serious consideration. So it's highly profile dependent, I would say. That's the way I look at it. Now, naturally, most of the people on this call and kind of who participate in these spaces are not desperate. I mean, people are not, let's be real, like most people that are participating in these spaces are at least middle class, if not middle upper class. So they are thinking about, and we are thinking about those kind of more downstream considerations like U.S. citizenship-based taxation. But I am a firm believer, though, that in all cases, people have to make a sober analysis, right? Like one thing that bugs the heck out of me is it seems like so many people are prone to start off with what they think is the right answer, and then they start backwards justifying and generalizing. It's not the way to go about it. Don't be attached to any answer. Just be attached to trying to get as close to the truth as possible, right? And really what that requires, in my opinion, is a sober analysis of all the benefits and drawbacks. Try to be as objective as possible about it, and then after the sober analysis, obviously come to the best conclusion you can about, what's best for you or your family. I really think that's the way of going about it. It's so easy to get caught up in, narratives, anti-Western narrative, the West is falling, the West is failing, or a narrative, an anti anything narrative. It's easy to fall into these, right? But really, we're just looking for what's the best the best path to maximum freedom of movement and maximum liability less or low liability citizenships, right? Freedom of movement through multiple citizenship. Okay, so we've been going for almost an hour now. It's 11:59 Pacific Standard, where I'm located on the West Coast. Any other considerations people want to bring up, or any questions, any points? Anybody want to push back on something before we talk about possible topics for the next mobility space?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Go for it.
Besides the obvious hassle of having to file for a CRBA for a U.S. child born abroad, are there any kind of follow-on effects of having a CRBA that are, I guess, that cause more friction during life rather than having, I guess, a state birth certificate?
Good question. I can't really think of one off the top of my head. I've had American clients that were born abroad that had a CRBA that I've applied for other citizenships for on their behalf for. So citizenship by descent and other types of citizenships. In my experience, the CRBAs, when we've submitted them, have been sufficient. There hasn't been pushback. We haven't been asked to buttress, the proof of their birth. So I haven't found any problems with the CRBA in that vein, right? So downstream, that person applying for another citizenship later on in their life. That's a really good question, though, David. I can't think of friction points off the top of my head from the CRBA, but I'd like to give more thought to it, and maybe I'll revisit that in a future mobility space. I welcome anybody else, or if anybody else can think of a friction point, come forth and speak. Or David, do you have one? Do you know of one?
No, I don't. But thanks.
No, that's a great point, and that's a consideration. Actually, I'll just say one thing one thing I just thought of. There could actually be confusion, right, on whether the person is a citizen or not. And I'll bring up an anecdote that I had from my practice. I had a lady who consulted with me in her 80s. Okay. Funny enough, born in Argentina. Okay. Born in Argentina I don't know what it was, the 1930s. I don't want to dox her, so I won't say the exact country, but born to parents, to a U.S. citizen mother and a father from a European country. Okay. She got a CRBA. Okay. Her parents applied for and obtained a CRBA for her. Okay. Shortly after her birth. I think it was maybe a year after her birth. So I believe it was the 1930s. Okay. Then they moved to the United States. Okay. Years later, so about a year or two ago, so many years later, 80 years later, she's consulting with me, right, about acquiring that citizenship of the country that her father was from, right? And this lady thought she had been naturalized. She thought that she naturalized in the United States, okay, after having been resident here as a teenager. And I obtained her documents. I did some research, and I found out that she was born a citizen. She was a citizen from birth. And she was confused about that all of her life. She thought that she was a naturalized US citizen. She had, in fact, been a citizen from birth all of her life. So I don't know if that, I guess we could loosely put that in the category, David, of what you mentioned, a potential drawback or a friction point. Just, it was a point of confusion. She was not actually sure. Not only was she not sure, she actually thought the opposite. She thought that she was not born a U.S. citizen and she had later naturalized. So maybe that would be, now granted, I think that's a fairly, maybe more on the unlikely side of friction points, but that's something, right? If she had been born in the United States, I don't think she would have been confused about whether she had been a citizen from birth.
So is a CRBA proof of U.S. citizenship, or is it maybe evidence in support of a possibility of U.S. citizenship?
So, excellent question. The CRBA that we had from her was proof of her citizenship. Okay, proof of U.S. citizenship. I'll pause. I'll stop myself from going so far off the cuff to say that that's always been the case. I don't want to make such a blanket statement. Because, as I mentioned before, the requirements for transmission of U.S. citizenship to a child born abroad to U.S. citizens are statutory, and in fact, they have changed over the 20th century a few times. Okay, so as a result, when you're actually doing an analysis for acquisition of U.S. citizenship, you have to actually look at there's charts out there where you have to basically there's time periods. If the person was born in this time period, okay, then you have to apply this this decision tree, etc. And so I don't know. I wouldn't go so far. I'm not sure if it's always been the case. Okay, so if everybody who's alive today who has a CRBA, irrespective of their age, if the CRBA serves as proof of citizenship, I'm not sure. I suspect it's probably the case, but I wouldn't be able to go so far as to say that.
Okay, so there are potentially other facts that might be determinants of that status.
Yeah, it could be. And look, I mean,
based on the statutes.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the uncomfortable truth about all of these documents proving citizenship is that they're rebuttable, right? Like, it might be very difficult to rebut them, right? But it's rebuttable. Okay, so I mean, let's take the gold standard. Okay, you're born in the United States. Okay, you're born in the United States. Okay, so you have a U.S. birth certificate, U.S. issued birth certificate. That's generally used when you go about your life. You can use that typically as proof of citizenship. Okay, so you can use that if you want to petition for somebody for a foreign spouse as a U.S. citizen. You could typically use that when you're applying for a driver's license, for other types of things. But is it absolute irrebuttable proof of a person's U.S. citizenship? No, it's not. It's not. Okay, it could still be rebutted. For example, if the U.S. government finds and proves that the person was the child of a U.S. diplomat, okay, it's rebuttable. Okay, these are all rebuttable. So, and then also you get to the fact that documents are sometimes issued in error. Sometimes the government claims that documents are issued in error. There's a famous case just a few years ago of an Iranian guy that was born in the United States, lived his whole life, as a U.S. citizen, thinking he's a U.S. citizen. Somehow he came, across the attention of Department of State, and the Department of State right now is made the claim that the guy was never a U.S. citizen, that all of his documents were issued in error because he claims that his father was not a U.S. or not a diplomat anymore when he was born. They claim he was still exercising diplomatic duties, right? And the question of his citizenship, turns on that issue. This is a guy who's lived his whole life as a U.S. citizen, passports, U.S. birth certificate, all that type of stuff, right? So it's a really uncomfortable, finite, aspect of the law, right? A person's citizenship rests on really presumptions, and some presumptions are stronger than others, right? But these are presumptions, right? And this is part of the reason that I have such a reaction when people use a document, as interchangeably as like with a status. They say like a passport is a citizen, or if it has a passport. No, documents are documents. The status is a separate thing. Even though the document serves as proof of the status is a separate thing, right? And I think mentally we really, really have to keep those things separately, because if you have distortion in your mental model, okay, on a status versus the document that proves that status, eventually downstream, when you start thinking about these things, you're gonna end up in confusion if you don't have those things kept straight. But anyway, yeah, that's a bit. I'm glad you asked that question, David. Great question, and I'm gonna think about that as well, and maybe that up in a future space, right? Because if we're talking, especially if we're talking about birth tourism, that would be an important consideration, right? Are you setting yourself up with your child up with a ticking time bomb in the form of a CRBA that creates some big friction downstream for them that we haven't really thought about? So, great question there. Okay, it's 12:08. We've been going for an hour and 6 minutes. What do we want to talk about? What are some topics for space number 29, the next space? Typically, I put up a poll, unless there's like wide consensus. I typically put up a poll with 3 or 4 options, and I let people decide what what the next topic should be. But I do give extra preference to any topic that's brought up by somebody in a space. Anybody have any suggestions? Okay, so some topics that we were considering, one was passport validity periods. 5 years, 10 years, old passports at 2 years, right? So that's these things matter, not just for how long you can use a given passport for, but also because oftentimes being resident in a particular country is dependent on having a valid passport, right? Of your home country of citizenship, and that can provide an attack vector. We've spoken before about how the U.S. Department of Justice, one of the tactics they use when they're trying to get back a U.S. citizen, extradition is difficult it's costly. It's difficult for the U.S. to do, right? They typically have to fight it out in court, in a foreign court, and an easier path and a tactic that sometimes the U.S. Department of Justice does is to cancel the passport of the U.S. citizen, especially if the person's legal status in a foreign country is dependent upon them having a valid passport. Because if the U.S. U.S. Department of State cancels the passport, well, that has obviously a domino effect of making their status in the country no longer valid. Okay, and then basically the U.S. Department of State just contacts their counterparts in that foreign country and says, hey, look, you have a U.S. citizen there. Your laws say that in order for him to be in valid status there, he has to have a valid passport. We just canceled his passport, so he's no longer in status. You're welcome to deport him. Okay, and what do you know? Deport him back to the United States. Okay, and that's a way that U.S. Department of Justice can kind of avoid sometimes having to go through the great cost and time suck of trying to extradite somebody. So all that hinges on passports, right? Passport validity period, having multiple passports, being able to toggle between passports. So maybe that would be a topic that we would consider: passport validity period. Another topic that we considered was the U.S. visa bond pilot program for B2 tourists. Okay, so for tourists from countries that have classically high visa overstay rates. If we do that topic, I thought we would just lump that in with kind of the greater topic of visiting the United States safely, let's say. So how to visit the United States safely. I don't know how attractive that is for this group because I think we have a lot of Americans here, as I've said before. But these are two topics that I have in mind. If nobody has any suggestions, then I'll just put those on the poll, and I'll add two more, and then we'll let everybody vote on them.
Hi, so I do have a suggestion. Have we done a space about citizenship by descent, like dedicated to that yet?
Yeah, we did. That was one of our earliest spaces. I did that one. It wasn't that popular. I think we only had one or two people attend live, and then I think it only has, if I'm not mistaken, I think it only has like 25 listens since. I'd be happy to revisit that. If see, the thing is, Jay, when we talk about citizenship by descent, we have to kind of talk about general considerations with examples of different countries, because there's so many countries and so many different rules between the countries. I'm happy to do that, to revisit that in space if we want to. But I find it's not that attractive if we just zero in on one country, because most listeners are not going to qualify for citizenship by descent in one particular country. But if you think a general discussion about it would be interesting, I'd be happy to revisit that as well.
I would say maybe a general discussion about that, but also kind of related to that could be a space about documentation and what documents people will typically need, and how and when to organize that.
Yeah, that was exactly the focus of our last citizenship by descent space, because that's the element that's kind of common, right? For example, Americans that are pursuing citizenship by descent. So we spoke about documents, getting documents, tough documents, using substitute evidence when you can't find the actual vital documents. And then, of course, we spoke about the FBI background check, which is almost always asked for American citizens that are naturalizing in another country. So we did speak about all that. I'm happy to revisit it. And honestly, that space, I think that was space number 6 or 7. We're on 28. We have kind of more participants now. So yeah, if other people show interest in that, I'll throw that up as a possibility on the poll. If it's either the winning option or at least second, then maybe we'll make that be the next space topic. Okay, great. Okay, we're going to wrap it up then. I want to thank everybody who was present, Hal, David, Jay, Chris, and of course our anonymous listeners. And I'm gonna circle back and find on that point. David brought up the point about the Mexican Constitutional Amendment 2021. I want to make sure that I didn't misspeak, so I'll research that point, come back, and I will post in the comments underneath the clarity on that point, whether the lack of generational limit is only prospective or if it's also backwards looking as well, because we don't want to mislead people, obviously, by making mistaken statements here. So thank you, everybody, and as always, we're going to have our next space on Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Tune in. Have a good one.